afternoon, dear students. A warm welcome to a new video on financial management. This is part 4. Now, in today's topic, we will discuss about fixed capital and the factors affecting the fixed capital requirements. Similarly, we will talk about working capital and the factors affecting working capital requirements. Now, let us first define fixed capital. Fixed capital represents a long-term investment which is needed to acquire fixed assets like land and building, plant and machinery, vehicles, etc. The benefits of which are expected to be received over a number of years in future. Now, how do we manage fixed capital? Let me explain. It refers to the allocation of firm's capital to different projects or assets which will have a long-term implication in the business. Now, let us discuss the importance of management of fixed capital. The first point talks about long-term growth. This capital is invested in fixed assets and long-term projects, therefore it will affect the future prospects of business. Let's talk about the second point. Large amount of funds are involved. A major portion of capital may be blocked in these areas. Hence, careful planning and detailed analysis is very essential in this segment. Talking about the third point, which is high risk. Investment decisions involve huge capital outlay, and it will influence the overall performance of the business. The fourth point, irreversible decision. Now, once the decision to acquire a permanent asset is taken, it becomes very difficult to reverse that decision. It is possible, but with huge losses. Now, let me talk about the factors affecting the requirement of fixed capital. The first point talks about nature of business. Manufacturing concerns require huge investment in fixed assets, and thus huge fixed capital is required for them. But the trading concerns need less fixed capital as they are not required to purchase plant and machinery. Let's talk about the second point, scale of operations. An organization operating on a large scale requires more fixed capital as compared to an organization operating on small scale. The third point talks about choice of technique. An organization using capital intensive techniques require more investment in plant and machinery as compared to an organization using labor-intensive techniques of production. Let's talk about the fourth point, technology upgradation. Organizations using assets which have become obsolete faster require more fixed capital as compared to other organizations. Let's talk about the fifth point, growth prospects. Companies having intention to grow faster require more fixed capital in order to expand their production capacity, which means more plant and machinery are required. The sixth point talks about diversification, and what do we mean? In case a company goes for diversification, then it will require more fixed capital to invest in fixed assets like plant and machinery, because you are producing a range of products in different sectors. Let's come down to distribution channels. The firm which sells its product through wholesalers and retailers requires less fixed capital. The eighth point talks about collaboration, and what does that mean? If companies are under collaboration or joint venture, then they need less fixed capital as they share the amount spent on plant and machinery with their collaborators. Now, in this slide, let us focus on working capital. Now, working capital is that part of capital required for investing in short-term or current assets like inventory, that is raw materials, work in progress and finished goods, bills receivable, sundry debtors, cash required for day-to-day affairs like salaries, wages, rent, etc. They provide liquidity to the business. There are two concepts of defining working capital. Gross working capital is equal to total investment in current assets. Net working capital is equal to current assets minus current liabilities. Now, let us discuss about factors that affect the working capital requirements of a business. So to start with, the first point, which is nature of business. A trading organization needs a lower amount of working capital as compared to a manufacturing organization, as trading organization undertakes no processing work. Let's come down to the second point, scale of operations. An organization operating on a large scale will require more inventory, and thus its working capital requirement will be more as compared to small organization. Let's talk about the third point, business cycle. In the time of boom, more production will be undertaken, and so more working capital will be required during that time as compared to recession or depression. Now let's talk about the fourth point, that is seasonal factors. So during peak season, the demand of a product will be high, and thus higher working capital will be required as compared to lean season or off season. Let's talk about the fifth point, that is credit allowed. Now, if credit is allowed by a concern to its customers, then it will require more working capital. But if goods are sold on cash basis, then less working capital is required. Let's talk about the sixth point, the credit availed. If a firm is able to purchase raw materials on credit from its suppliers, then less working capital will be required. Now let's talk about the seventh point, which is inflation. Now how do we elaborate? Working capital requirement is also determined by price level changes. Say for example, during inflation, prices of raw material, wages also rise, resulting in increase in working capital requirements. Let's talk about the eighth point, that is operating cycle. Now, operating cycle or turnover of working capital means the speed with which the working capital is converted into cash by sale of goods. If it is speedier, the amount of working capital required will be less. Let's talk about the ninth point, availability of raw materials. If raw materials are available regularly without any shortage, less working capital is needed. Let's talk about the last point, growth prospects. If a firm is growing fast, it will require large amount of working capital to meet higher production and sales. In this slide, let us talk about the 11th point, that is operating efficiency. If cash, debtors and inventories are efficiently managed, working capital requirement can be reduced. The 12th point, which is level of competition. In case the competition is high, more shall be the stock of finished goods. This increases the working capital requirement of business. Thank you, children, for being patient.